Recording, and I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Kanarek.
I need to unmute. I feel like I've been away from teaching on Zoom over the whole summer, and this is the second time I'm teaching on Zoom today. So I'm re-getting my Zoom teaching, so to speak, legs wet and warmed up again with all the buttons I need to push and the way I need to move you around the screen. So every now and then there may be some moments of technological non-smoothness. So first of all, thank you so much, Rav Tiferet, for inviting me to teach and to be part of the TVZ community. It's really a treat. I just came from the JCDS picnic with Rav Claudia, who kicked me out and said, Jane, you have to go. You have to go teach for me. Go. So I left. Anyway, so with all of that, gratefulness to be here with you this evening. So I hope that we're going to encounter the divine tonight, this evening, but I can't promise it. And the reason I can't promise it is because I can never promise it, because who really knows when we're going to encounter the divine, though I do think at TVZ you do a wonderful job of encountering the divine. But also because we are going to go to a troubling place. This is not a place of automatic uplift that we're going to go to this evening. We're going to dive into the relationship of Sarah and Hagar, and Sarah and Abraham and Yitzchak, and Abraham and Sarah. So in other words, we're going to dive into really some of the most troubling relationships that are at the heart of our Rosh Hashanah liturgy. And we're not going to whitewash, but we're really going to go into the heart of thinking about what might have been the relationship between Sarah and Hagar, what might have happened, and where might in particular Sarah have been. So we're going to do that, though, through looking at the relationships within Sarah's family, immediate family itself, through the relationships between Sarah and Abraham, as I said, Sarah and Yitzchak and his mother, and Abraham, his son, and his wife. And from there, we're going to circle back to Sarah and Hagar. So in Bereshit Kaf Aleph, in Genesis 21, which we will eventually read together, Sarah sends away Hagar, presumably to die in the desert, and her son presumably with her, her son Ishmael presumably with her, presumably also to die in the desert. It is part of the story that we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. Needless to say, but I'm going to say it because often we say things that are needless to say. It is deeply troubling, deeply problematic, and puts the question of how do we treat others, and also in particular, what does it mean for a mother to treat another mother like that, at the center of some of our questions of Rosh Hashanah. So that's what I want to foreground here. We're really going to be talking about mothers and children. That's the larger picture. The smaller picture is, or maybe it's not my smaller picture, but it's my interest in the genre of rabbinic Midrash. Midrash as seeking out meaning in the biblical text, really going to the classic meaning of darash as to seek out meaning, to seek out what has been hidden. And the biblical text is sometimes filled with emotion, but often we have to imagine what actually are the emotions, what might be there. And we're going to turn to the genre of Midrash to actually see how did the ancients, our rabbis from the 5th century, from the 6th, 8th, 9th, 13th century, how did they imagine the emotions that these characters were feeling? And as we turn to looking at how these ancients or medievals were imagining the emotions of these characters, we're also going to ask ourselves, how do we react to their imaginings of their emotions? What might we want to do with those? And then what resources for tshuva might these ancient and medieval imaginings of emotion do for us? So much as we're going to begin with the biblical text, we're going to turn from there to the Midrashic retellings of the narrative of the Akedah. So we're going to do day 1 of Rosh Hashanah, day 2 of Rosh Hashanah. You'll have the Torah reading covered by the time we're done together. We're going to start, though, I'm going to share screen in a moment. We are going to start actually with neither of those. We're going to start with Bereshit Kaf Gimel, Genesis 23, the story of Sarah's death. And so I'm going to share screen right now so you can see what we will be studying together. I'm telling you what I'm doing right now. I'm moving you around to my screen so that I can see all of you. Oh, sorry. Okay. Whenever I share screen, Zoom never puts the boxes of faces exactly like I like to have them. So we just have to readjust. Okay, great. So can you all see the sheet? Great. Ooh, too big. Too big, too big, too big, too big. Okay. So I just called it These Are the Lives of Sarah and Hagar, Rethinking a Relationship. We are going to start with verses from Genesis 23, Bereshit Kaf Gimel. These verses are actually about Sarah's death, and that's where we're going to begin together today. So I'm going to read them in Hebrew and English. Vayihu chaye Sarah, mea shana v'yesrim shana v'sheva shanim, shnei chaye Sarah. Vatamot Sarah, v'kiryat arba, hi Hebron, v'eretz Canaan, vayavo Avraham lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. Sarah's lifetime, the span of Sarah's life, came to 127 years. Sarah died in Kiryat Arba, now Hebron in the land of Canaan, and Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. So this is the very, very end of Sarah's life. The ironic name of the Parsha is Chaye Sarah, after these words here, Vayihu Chaye Sarah. These are the years of Sarah, but the Parsha is not actually really about Sarah. It's actually about the betrothal of Rivka and Yitzchak. But nevertheless, it opens with the tale of Sarah's death and Avraham mourning for her. Now, I'm just going to pause here, and I'm going to just invite for the moment if there are any comments that you would like to make about the way in which Genesis 23 in these 2 verses talks about the death of Sarah. If there are no comments, we'll go on, but I'm going to pause and you can unmute. Okay, great. We're going to go to the next one. So Genesis 23, the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is Genesis 22. Bereshit Kaf Bet. It is not up here, but I want you to know that the Akedah, the story of the binding of Isaac, takes place right before these few verses about the death of Sarah. And that's going to lead us to a really important rabbinic concept called smichut parshiot, really the attachment, the closeness of one parsha to another. There are times when one parsha, one section of the Torah is very close to another section of the Torah. What the rabbis will do is say, you can learn from the juxtaposition of one portion to the other portion. So that's what they are about to do. I'm going to give you right now, this is the commentary of Rashi, so our 11th century famous French commentator on the Torah, Northern France. I almost said he was Franco-German, but that's not correct, Northern France. And this is what he says about the verse. To bewail Sarah and to weep for her. Lispod l'Sarah v'livkota. That's right here. Abraham proceeded to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. And this is what he says. The narrative of the death of Sarah follows immediately on that of the binding of Isaac, because through the announcement of the binding, that her son had been made ready for sacrifice and had almost been sacrificed, her soul flew from her and she died. So to unpack this, why does Sarah, in the Torah, why does the story of Sarah follow directly upon the Akedah. According to Rashi, it's because through some announcement of the Akedah, of the binding, somehow Sarah knew about this. And what did she know? She found out that her son had been made ready for sacrifice. Shenizdamen b'na l'shchita. Shchita is the word for that is used both in the biblical narrative and to talk about the sacrificing of an animal. That her son had been made ready for sacrifice and had almost been sacrificed. So according to Rashi, she knows that her son Isaac survived. Nevertheless, the news of the preparation of Yitzchak for sacrifice and his near death caused her soul to fly out from her, and she died. This is Rashi. Why does Sarah die directly after the Akedah? She receives news of the binding, and even though she also gets news that he survived, out of shock, her soul flies from her and she dies. This is our tradition number 1. So one of the things about Rashi, so actually I'm going to pause here and say, already this is a pretty shocking Midrash. She doesn't simply die of old age. It's not simply that she's 127. It's that her husband's actions, in a sense, caused her death. She dies of a heart attack from shock. Now, one of the things about Rashi is that what Rashi is often doing is drawing on earlier Midrashic traditions. He doesn't just make this stuff up. He's actually often a storehouse of earlier Midrashic traditions. So what I've done now is I've set the scene with Rashi, but what we're going to now do is dip into some of the earlier Midrashic traditions, which are going to flesh this out even more fully and take us more deeply into, in some ways, the tangled relationships within Sarah's family. Okay? I'm going to pause here if there are any comments or questions. Judith.
I just want to mention that the way in which we're told about how old Sarah is also kind of generates some kind of, what shall we say, a sense of disturbance. It says she was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. I mean, the English made it smooth English, but it literally says 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And so Rashi has what to say about that. But I know we don't want to spend that much time on this, but I think that even just encountering that makes us realize that there's something really disturbing in Sarah's life as we look about the arc of her life, the trajectory of her life from the moment when she dies.
Thank you. We're actually going to spend some time on talking exactly about what you just noted, Judith, at the end, that disturbing, I love the phrase you use, disturbance, and I've highlighted it in purple in the Hebrew, of the way that it says 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. And the other thing that I want to add here is that it also repeats, right? Shnei Chaye Sarah. These are the years of the life of Sarah at the end of the verse in Hebrew. So there's this almost as if the verse is emphasizing or extending her life in the specificity of the years and the way in which it says those years. Okay. So from here, we're going to go to the Tankum. Let me tell you about a little bit about the Tankum. So the Tankum actually refers to a genre of literature, and it is really a compilation, and it shows up in a number of different compilations, some called the Tankum, some in another Midrash called Devarim Rabbah. And the compilation basically dates from around the 5th century of the Common Era. And the majority of it is likely from the 6th and 7th century of the Common Era. So that's the 400s to the 500s and 600s. One way to think about the Tanhuma is that it re-narrates the Bible, blending together biblical verses and its own retellings. There are other things to do with the Tankuma, but for now, that's the important part. And I just want you to know that we're going into the 5th, 6th, 7th century. So back from Rashi, we're now going back into another world. So this is from Genesis 22:4. This is the story of the Akedah. And it opens with the quote, Vayaret hamakom merachok, and he, Abraham, saw the place from afar. This is a description of Abraham seeing Har Moriah, Mount Moriah, where he is going to eventually bind Isaac. So I'm going to read how the Tanhuma imagines what is going on in Abraham's head. Said Abraham, what shall I do? If I reveal my intention to Sarah, women's intellect is light upon them in minor matters, all the more so in a great matter such as this. So remember, God has commanded him, I'm going to test you. Take your son, take your only son, the one whom you love. And Abraham says, what shall I do? If I reveal my intention to Sarah, well, women's intellect is light when it comes to easy things. So all the more so in a great matter such as this, such as God saying, take my son. But if I do not reveal my intention to her and steal him from her, at a moment when she will not see him, she will kill herself. So what does Abraham say? Well, on the one hand, if I tell her, she's not going to let me do it, because women don't get how great this stuff is. Like, God's commanded me to take this child. She's not going to get it. But if I hide it from her and steal him and just take him away, right, kidnap him in essence, then she's going to kill herself. We'll talk more about that in a minute, or I'll open it up to you. What did he do? He said to Sarah, Abraham said to Sarah, prepare for us food and drink so that we may eat and be happy. She went and prepared food. When they were in the midst of the food, he said to her, you know that when I was 3, I recognized my creator, but this lad has grown up and has not been educated. There is a place a bit far away from us where lads are educated. I will take him there and I will educate him there. She said to him, go in peace. Immediately, and Abraham rose up early in the morning. So this explains, why did Abraham rise up early in the morning to take his son? He told Sarah this whole story about how he was finally taking Yitzchak, in essence, to school to turn him into a Jew. So there are a number of things that are alluded to here that I'm going to turn to before I turn to you. So you know that when I was 3, I recognized my creator. There is a Midrashic tradition found in another compilation, Bereshit Rabbah, Genesis Rabbah, which tells the story of how Abraham came to know God, and portrays him as a 3-year-old, in essence, when he starts to question polytheism, multiple gods, and come to belief in the one God. Now, I will tell you, I went to Hebrew school at KI, and when I came back to studying Torah, I was convinced that this story of Abraham hiding in a cave and God revealing God's self to Abraham and Abraham breaking his father Terach's idols was all in the Torah. And I reread Bereshit, this was when in college, I reread Genesis 5 times to try and find this story of Abraham breaking the idols and hiding in the cave and saying, it's not the sun, it's not the moon, it must be one God, until I realized, oh, it's not there. And so that was my introduction to Midrash, was seeking out this story. Nevertheless, this is the story he tells Sarah. I need to educate our son. There's a place far away. I'm going to take him there to educate him. And Sarah says, fine, take him. So I'm going to pause here before I say anything else about this passage to invite your comments on this passage. Comments or questions? So I want to highlight a few things. First of all, is Abraham's emotional consciousness that when she will not see him, she will kill herself. So according to this Midrash, Avraham actually has an understanding of the depth of the relationship between Sarah and their son Yitzchak. And he knows what it will do to her to lose him. She is the son of his old age, the miraculous son. And he knows that if she just kidnaps her, gone. She will actually kill herself. So he knows that this is a possibility when he takes Yitzchak for the Akedah. He knows this is a possibility. He also knows, according to this Midrash, that she wants her son to be educated. And so you can see them remaking Yitzchak almost as a rabbinic Jew, but Avraham creating a whole ruse to cover up for his wife what he is about to do. Judith.
So I hear what you're saying about Abraham's sensitivity to the relationship between Sarah and Yitzchak, but I have often felt as though when he says, well, if she doesn't see him, if the boy just disappears, she's going to kill herself, that it feels to me like a put down of Sarah, that she is incapable of understanding this high matter of this great mission that Abraham has taken on and Yitzchak brought along with him, and that she's as though he were like Freud, calling women hysterical and having this overreaction of killing herself.
Yeah, you know, what's really interesting about that is that it's almost like he finds this middle ground at the end. Excuse me for one sec. My son's asking me for something. Dean, you gotta ask Abba, okay? No. Okay, sorry. I'm all lost in my. What's interesting is that with what you're saying is that he seems to find this middle ground in the bottom part where he does seem to imagine her as having a stake in their son being educated in the proper way, which is really interesting to me as well. So I have to think more about whether this is hysterical. Diane. Unmute, please.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Is it implied here that he is the primary parent? Well, number one, and that in addition to what both of you said about the greater purpose that, I mean, it looks so traditional that Sarah is the emotional relationship, you know, and you don't know where Isaac really stands in that between his two parents. So the whole thing looks, I mean, the only upside is Sarah's actually talked about, which she isn't in other places. But besides from that, it's a very it looks secondary and traditional, which it is, but in the sense of what's her bond with her son, which is one of that she has an emotional dependency on him.
I agree with you for this and this picture that she seems to have an emotional dependency on him. Actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure who's the primary parent here. Certainly Abraham, the Midrash is imagining Abraham as responsible for Yitzchak's formal education. And on the other hand, he seems to know he can't just take his son, that she needs to consent as well to him taking the son. But yes, she is portrayed as the emotional one, or to use Judith's words, the hysterical one. And Abraham is the one who is prepared to listen to God's call and take him. But we are going to see Midrashim, which bring in Yitzchak's voice. And part of our job, I want to say, is both listen to how these Midrashim imagine Sarah's voice, but also how we might want to imagine it as well. Because what I think these Midrashic traditions do is also give us permission to imagine and to step in, because they're stepping in as well into the biblical text. And so it also gives us permission to step in and imagine. So let's turn to a different one. This is from a Midrash called Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, from around the 5th century of the Common Era. And this is talking about Abraham when God says, take your son. So a son was born to him at 100 years, and ultimately the Holy Blessed One said to him, take your son. And Abraham journeyed a distance of 3 days. After 3 days, he saw a cloud resting on the top of the mountain. He said to him, my son, do you see what I see? He said, yes. What do you see? Said Abraham. I see a cloud resting on the top of the mountain. He said to Ishmael and Eliezer, 2 servants, do you see anything? They said to him, no. He said to them, since you don't see anything, and this donkey doesn't see, remain here with the donkey. Not, let's just say, deeply problematic of comparing these servants to a donkey, a people similar to a donkey. He took his son Isaac and brought him up mountains and down into valleys. He brought him up one of the mountains and built an altar and arranged the pile of wood for a sacrifice and took the knife to slaughter him. And if an angel had not called out to him from heaven, he would already have been slaughtered. Know that this is true, for Isaac returned to his mother. She said to him, where have you been, my son? He said to her, my father took me and brought me up mountains and down into valleys, etc. She said, alas, for the son of a hapless woman. If it were not for the angel, you would have already been slaughtered. He said to her, yes. At that time, she cried out 6 cries, corresponding to the 6 blasts of the shofar. It has been said, she had scarcely finished the matter when she died. This is the meaning of what is written, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. So I'll go back. It's a pretty troubling midrash. So Abraham journeys 3 days with his son, and then after 3 days, they see this miraculous cloud that only they can see resting on the top of the mountain. Both Yitzhak and Abraham can see the cloud, the servants can't. So Abraham then goes alone with his son Isaac, and they journey up and down mountains, and he brings up one, builds an altar, arranges the pile of wood for a sacrifice, and has the knife, is all ready to slaughter his son. And the Midrash goes on to say, look, if an angel hadn't called out to him, Abraham would have done it. It makes it very, very explicit that Abraham would have done it. He was only stopped by the angel. And the proof is, know that this is true. For Isaac actually returned. And where did he return to? He returned to his mother. It's now not simply mother to son relationship, but you can see son to mother. He goes back, he goes away from the father who tried to kill him, and he goes to his mother. And when he returns, she says to him, where have you been? And he tells her about the whole journey. And it seems like it's implied that he tells her what his father was about to do with him. And she cries out, almost verifies, if it were not for the angel, you would have already been slaughtered. And he says, yes, that's what my father would have done to me. And then she cries out 6 cries corresponding to the 6 blasts of the shofar. So this is one of our traditions, that when we hear the shofar, what we're actually hearing is Sarah's cries over the news of what Abraham was about to do to her son. Then the Midrash ends with, it has been said, she had scarcely finished these crying out when she died. And this is the meaning of what is written, and Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. Vayavo Abraham lispod l'Sarah b'livkota. The implication of the Midrash is that Abraham was somewhere else, and he had to actually come from that somewhere else to mourn for her. So in my reading, this Midrash shifts shines the spotlight on Abraham, but on Yitzchak and his relationship to his mother, and in a sense, his rejection of his father. When she asks him, if it were not for the angel, you would have already been slaughtered. And he says to her, yes. And then she cries out these cries of despair, which are then translated into our shofar. So the shofar becomes a remembrance of Yitzchak returning to his mother and telling her what happened. And then she dies from the shock. And then Abraham comes from this other place to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her. We don't know of his relationship with his son at all from this verse, but here we do see the son returning to the mother. So it's similar to the other Midrash that we saw from the Tankum, but it's also slightly different with this emphasis on the son. I'm going to just pause here once again. Sherry.
This is the only place I have never before seen a text that had Isaac and Sarah being reunited. In fact, I've learned the opposite, that she never saw him or heard from him again. And there are other sources of the way she wailed and their relation to the cries of the shofar. Does this appear anywhere else besides this Midrash and Leviticus Rabbah? That Isaac came back to Sarah?
That is a great question. I'm actually going to ask Judith if you know if this appears elsewhere, if this tradition of Isaac returning. I'm just scrolling down. Judith, can you unmute?
Sorry. Aviva Zornberg, in the essay she wrote in Beginning Anew, which is the collection of women thinking about the high holiday texts, biblical texts that Gail Reamer and I put out. Aviva actually goes through a number of the versions of this midrash about Sarah, and you'll find there. She certainly quotes both the Tanchuma and the Vayikra Rabbah that Jane has brought here, and a couple of others as well. So I would recommend just taking a look at that, and it's also a very powerful commentary on these midrashim.
Yeah. So I don't know, but yeah, here it's striking, right? They re-engage in relationship. Jeffrey, unmute.
I didn't hear the full sentence. They re-engage.
They re-engage in relationship here, Sarah and her son.
Uh-huh.
So I always think of this story, the Akedah, and also the Hagar and Ishmael story, as really the most horrible thing in the Torah. And the idea is supposed to be, I think, that if God tells you to do something, no matter what it is, you're supposed to do it. And that I always thought was a flaw in Abraham. So these drash are basically intensifying this feeling that I have, and I was hoping maybe I gained some positive understanding instead of condemning Abraham.
So I actually think these midrashim condemn Abraham. I don't think he comes out of them looking so good.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what I thought it would be.
Yeah, I think they are. These, in some ways, they're texts of horror. And I think that they're standing with you and saying, don't just say so simply that it was wonderful that Abraham listened to God's word. There's a tragedy here as well. So that's how I read these midrashic texts, as tragic. And they're heightening the tragedy of the story. Wait, let me just make sure. Sorry, I scrolled down too far. Okay, we are going back to the Tankum again. The Tankum here is jumping off from the place in the story of the Akedah where they get to Har Hamoria, and Abraham has bound his son on the altar. So this is the actual slaughter story as retold by the Tankum. So when Abraham came to slaughter, he, Isaac, said to him, "Father, bind my hands and legs, because the instinct of life is strong. And when I see the knife, perhaps I will tremble and invalidate the sacrifice. Please do not make a blemish on me." So this is a phenomenally horrifying text. Isaac is totally aware of what his father is about to do to him. According to this passage in the Tankum, he doesn't say, "Father, stop." He says, "Father, tie me up tightly because I want to live. And what am I going to do when I see the knife? I'm going to tremble." And a sacrifice, he now compares himself to an animal sacrifice. If a sacrifice is blemished or the knife is used wrong and creates a blemish, the sacrifice is invalid. So here Yitzchak is saying to his father, "Please do it correctly. Tie me up really tightly." It's a text of terror. Immediately, and Abraham sent out his hand and took the knife to slaughter. So it was immediately after this that Abraham sends his hand and takes the knife to slaughter his son. And now, Diane, I think you asked, where's Isaac's voice? So here's how the Tanhuma at least is imagining Isaac's voice. He said to him, Isaac said to his father, "Father, do not announce this to my mother when she stands by a cistern or when she stands on the roof. Perhaps she will cause herself to fall and die." Immediately they both built the altar, and he bound him on the altar and took the knife to slaughter him. So here Isaac says, "Don't tell my mother this when she's standing somewhere where she could jump and die." So we can take Judith of "this is imagining women or Sarah as hysterical." I actually read it as Isaac knowing that she will not be able to live with this news, and what she will do if she hears not only that her son is dead, but also that Abraham has done this to their son. So Jeffrey, again, heightening the horror, and I think the critique of Abraham here. And immediately then this Midrash imagines not Isaac going innocently to the slaughter. This is not a little boy who doesn't know what his father is about to do. This is a boy or a young man who knows how old he is here, building the altar with his father, and then agreeing to be bound on the altar and even telling his father how to tie him. When a fourth of a log of blood had come out of him, Satan, that's a certain amount of blood, which I think is what is necessary to cause corpse impurity. It's a whole rabbinic technical thing of what causes corpse impurity if you're in a tent, a covered area. When a fourth of a log of blood had come out of him, Satan came and shoved Abraham's hand, and the knife fell from his hand. So what happens? Abraham's actually begun the cut. This isn't the angel comes early and stops him. This is Abraham has cut his son, and then Satan comes and shoves Abraham's hand, like the evil, the bad guy, whoever Satan is in this genre of rabbinic literature, but he's the counterpart of God. He comes and he shoves Abraham's hand, and the knife fell from his hand. When he sent his hand to take it, so now here Abraham tries again, right? He goes for the knife again. A heavenly voice came out and said to him from the heavens, "Do not raise your hand against the boy. If it were not for this, he would already have been slaughtered." So here Abraham is imagined as really wanting to do it. At that time, the Satan went to Sarah and presented himself in the likeness of Isaac. So this is not Isaac going back, but the Midrash, the later Midrash, imagining Satan going back. When she saw him, she said to him, "My son, what did your father do to you?" He said to her, "My father took me and brought me up mountains and took me down valleys, and then brought me up on the top of one mountain and built an altar and arranged the pile of wood for a sacrifice and bound me on the altar and took the knife to slaughter me. If it were not for the fact that the Holy Blessed One said to him, 'Do not raise your hand against the boy,' I would already have been slaughtered." He did not finish saying the matter before her soul went out. This is the meaning of what is written, "And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah and to bewail her." From where did he come? From Mount Moriah. So where did Abraham come from? From where he'd been about to kill their son. So here, Sarah's death, this Midrash imagines Sarah's death not as a result of Isaac coming, but Satan coming, actually, as a way of getting at her, getting at Abraham, getting at God, really. and saying, this is what your husband did. He was ready to kill your son. And so for me, in this Midrash, I'm not clear whether the Midrash imagines her death out of horror of what almost happened to her son, or out of horror at what her husband had been willing to do. It may actually be horror at both that this Midrash is imagining her death caused by. So these are pretty horrific texts. If the Akedah was a horrific story in the Torah itself, it's made even more so, I think, in these Midrashic passages. I'm just going to pause here for any reactions or comments to this version of the story. I promise we will get out of suicide and all of that. I do promise. Okay.
Yeah, I don't understand the verbal connection, either this time or the earlier time of V'zeha Davar, that this is what it means. How there's a missing link there. How do they derive from what we've just read that this is where you get Vayavo Avraham, Lispod Sarah?
Oh, it's just from Vayavo, where they're assuming with the verb that he had to come from somewhere and he came.
Right.
So they don't know where he came from. So once you've assumed that that they're happening one after the other, that the death of Sarah is happening right after the Akedah, that there's no time lapse, then where did he have to come from? He had to come from Har Moria. That's how it's working. It's more of a narrative link than a direct verbal link. Judith?
Also, just following up on your characterization of these stories, what this particular little midrashic move is not only technical, I think, but it's suggesting that Abraham either didn't bother to, or he was afraid to come back to Sarah after the Akedah, and he was off somewhere else, unable to come back, having gone through all of this with their son.
Right. It opens the whole question of, would he have come back at all while she was alive? Right. What happened to their marriage? Would he have come back? Because he only comes back, it seems, because she's dead. So I want to give you another tradition, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, an 8th or 9th century Midrash. So we're moving a little bit later. When Abraham returned from Mount Moriah in peace, the anger of Samael was kindled, for he saw that the desire of his heart to frustrate, again, this evil being, for he saw that the desire of his heart to frustrate the offering of our father Abraham had not been realized. What did he do? He went and said to Sarah, "Have you not heard what has happened in the world?" She said to him, "No." He said to her, "Your husband Abraham has taken your son Isaac and slain him and offered him up as a burnt offering upon the altar." And the lad cried and wailed that he could not be saved. Immediately she began to cry and to wail. She cried 3 times, corresponding to the 3 sustained notes of the shofar, and she gave forth 3 wails corresponding to the 3 disconnected short notes of the shofar, and her soul fled and she died. So here, Samael, this kind of Satan, did not actually succeed in getting Abraham to sacrifice Yitzchak. So instead, he goes and he tells Sarah that Abraham had actually gone through with the sacrifice, and Yitzchak was not consenting. The lad cried and the lad wailed, and he could not be saved. And immediately Sarah begins to cry and wail. And in this, you imagine the shofar as the last breaths of her life, that she dies with these cries of despair. So that's the last tradition that I want to show you from there. I want to turn actually now to Genesis 21, because I said this was also going to be about Sarah and Hagar. And to this point, what we've done is we've looked at the midrashic imaginings of Sarah, Yitzchak, and Abraham, and the different ways in which they are imagining the relationship one to the other. So I want to turn to the other Akedah, not quite Akedah, but I'm going to use that terminology here of the other near death and sacrifice of a child. And that's what we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So this is how we're going to begin circling back to these two women, to Sarah and Hagar, and their relationship with one another. So I'm going to read Bereshit Kaf Aleph, or part of Bereshit Kaf Aleph. We're starting from verse 9. Sarah saw the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham playing. She said to Abraham, "Cast out that slave woman and her son, for the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly, for it concerned a son of his. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed over the boy or your slave. Whatever Sarah tells you, do as she says, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be continued for you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him too, for he is your seed." Early next morning, Abraham took some bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He placed them over her shoulder together with the child and sent her away. And she wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water was gone from the skin, she left the child under one of the bushes and went and sat down at a distance, a bow shot away, for she thought, "Let me not look on as the child dies." And sitting thus afar, she burst into tears. God heard the cry of the boy, and an angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heeded the cry of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make a great nation of him." Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and let the boy drink. God was with the boy, and he grew up. He dwelt in the wilderness and became a bowman. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother got a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So this is the story of the casting out of Hagar and Ishmael. But you can see the many parallels with the Akedah story. Here, it's not God commanding Abraham, "Sacrifice your son," but it is Sarah commanding Abraham, "Send away your wife and your son, cast her out." You can see Abraham's distress here. It's almost as if the story is the warm-up for the Akedah. And God says to Abraham, "Do not be distressed. Whatever Sarah tells you, Shema b'kolah, do as she says." Interestingly enough, these words Shema b'kolah, according to the Talmud, are the words through which it derives that Sarah is actually a prophet, that she can understand. She knows the divine will. Listen to her word, her voice. She actually knows she's a prophet. So God says to Abraham, "Listen to her voice, because it's through Isaac that offspring shall be continued. Don't worry, the slave woman, I will make a nation of him too." And so early the next morning, Vayashkem Avraham baboker, it's the same phrase as we have in the Akedah story. Abraham got up early in the morning, takes some bread, a skin of water, and as he will with his son, well, he gives them to Hagar, and then he sends her away, and she wanders in the wilderness of Beersheba. She goes on a journey. Here we know what Hagar is feeling in a sense. We don't know what Ishmael is feeling in this, just as we don't know in the biblical version what Yitzchak is feeling. But here we're told that she cries. Much as Abraham weeps on Sarah's death, here we see that Hagar is weeping as she watches her child, who she is sure is about to die. And she bursts into tears. God hears the cry of the boy. An angel calls to Hagar and saves the boy and saves Hagar. Much as in the Akedah, again, an angel saves the boy. So reading this story in conversation with the Akedah, and in conversation with these other texts, I also ask myself, where did Sarah think again about Hagar after her experience with the Akedah, after her husband took their son and almost killed him? What did she think about what she had done to Hagar and to Ishmael? Did she consider it? What went through Sarah's head about this earlier, in a sense, Akedah, that she also had a part in? So I want to switch here to a comment of Chizkuni, Chizkuni is a 13th century French commentator on the Tanakh. Here, what we're going to look at is just the words Vihyu Vayihu Chaye Sarah. These are the lives of Sarah. So this phrase, just as Judith noticed earlier, the opening line is paradoxical in the number of times that it counts Sarah's years. It doesn't just say she was 127, but specifies each of them. Vayihu, these are, it says the plural of the lives of Sarah. And so often, I'm going back up to the top, that is just counted at, that is translated as Sarah's lifetime, how long she lived. But we're going to be actually hyper literal here as I scroll back down to the bottom and say Vayihu Chaye Sarah. These are the lives of Sarah. So this is how Chizkuni understands it. Harotzim lemanot gematriot omer keminyan vayihu. Those that want to count gematria say that like the number of the word vayihu was her life. So in gematria, if we assign a number to each of these letters, vav is 6, yud is 10, hey is 5, yud is 10, and vav is 6. That gets us to 37. Hopefully that's correct. That gets us to 37. Okay, so that's the gematria we're playing with. That is 37 years, which is equivalent to the day that Isaac was born until the day of the Akedah when she died. But the 90 years that she lived before that are not counted as life because one who does not have sons is equivalent to a dead person. So I want to start and say, one could just say horrific. Let me explain this text a little bit more, but that's not where I want to go with it. So what this text is saying is reading Vayihu as gematria 37. So when did Sarah have a life? Sarah had a life for 37 years, which was from the day of Yitzchak's birth when she was 90 to his death at the age of 37. The 90 years that she lived before that don't count as part of her life because one who does not have sons is equivalent to a dead person. Wonderful. So as someone who is my first child at 41, a son, I do hope that my 41 years up to then counted. I count them. That's my little joke there. But I want to take what Chizkuni is saying somewhat seriously, but in a very different direction. What Chizkuni is pointing us to, albeit in a very patriarchal way, is that people have different stages of their lives and different understandings of their lives. And so what Chizkuni is pointing us to is that from the time that Yitzchak was born until he died, until the day of the Akedah, when she died, that marked a turning point in her life, a different way perhaps of approaching relations, the world, etc. And the 90 years before that were different. So these are the lives of Sarah. According to Chizkuni, she in a sense had two different lives. So I'm going to scroll up to Vayihu Chaye Sarah, to the verse, this very first words. These are the lives of Sarah, 100 years, 20 years and 7 years, Shnei Chaye Sarah. It literally means these are the years of Sarah's life. But we can also read this word Shnei here as Shnayim, two. These are the two lives of Sarah. I think that's the other thing that Chizkuni is picking up on. So where do I want to take this idea of her having two lives, one from when Isaac was born until her death, and a previous one? I want to actually look at her death for a moment. These Midrashic traditions focused on the horror of what Avraham had done to Yitzchak or was about to do to him, and Sarah's death as a result of her perhaps shock and horror at nearly losing her son. But I want to propose something else, which is that she does have Shnei Chaye Sarah. She does have two lives. She does have two understandings of her life. She dies actually, in my reading, from two things. One is her shock at what Abraham was willing to do to her son. But the other is her shock at what she had done to Hagar and Ishmael. So what do I see happening at the very end of her life? Those cries those 3 and 3, perhaps in the tradition of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer, we might understand those 6 shofar blasts, 3 as for what was done to her and her son, and then 3 as her tshuva for what she had done earlier to Yishmael and to Hagar. So I actually read the story of Hagar's death as in many ways the story of Sarah's death as a tragic story of repentance, that she understands not only what her husband was willing to do, but now also what she had been willing to do and the tragedy of that. And she dies in essence of sorrow at what she had once done. So I wouldn't call this a redemptive reading of the story at all. I'm not sure that one can actually redeem it. But for me, it is a way of confronting the horror of the story. And for me, it is a way of saying, Sarah looked at what she had done to this other woman and her child. And had she lived longer, perhaps she would have found a way to actually do active tshuva. Perhaps that's our task, is to imagine that kind of repentance or to ourselves do that kind of tshuva. But I do think that at the end of her life, she understood what she had done. And that's where I'm going to stop. Jeffrey.
Okay.
Okay, so I just read this thing pretty carefully, and one thing that struck me is a little detail, and that was that when Hagar walked away from her son and put him behind the bush, and because she couldn't stand to see him, she really cried very loudly. Bacht, I think she said. And anyway, and then when the angel, the messenger, God's messenger, came and he said, "Don't worry, because God has heard your son's cry." But the Torah doesn't say anything about her son crying. So again, that to me might indicate a little bit more about what the Torah says about women in a situation like this. She cried, not the son.
So multiple levels in which erasure can happen. But again, I see that as our task, to notice where it doesn't happen, or to notice where we can, reveal what the invisible ink, that's the image that I'm looking for, actually reveal what the invisible ink says. I'm thinking of the writing letters with lemon juice and then holding a flame underneath it to actually make those letters show. Well, when I read these stories, I assume that women were there. So our task is to uncover it. And sometimes it's there in our textual record and sometimes it's not. And so we have to imagine it in. But that's our task, is to make the invisible ink in all of its messiness shine through. Diane?
It's interesting to me. I want to go over this, but when we read the story from the Torah, about Sarah is the one that stands out in a very negative way, I think, generally. You know, that because she can't give birth, she takes on a surrogate, somebody is a surrogate parent, and in 21st century understanding, there's a lot of racism involved in that, and class bias involved in that. Abraham is sort of portrayed a little bit as a wimp. And then Sarah makes him get rid of Ishmael and Hagar. So it's very, very negative. It's very sexist. There's nothing very redeeming. So even though in all these stories, it's not a fight exactly for equality. I mean, that's not what's being dealt with. But I do understand, I think what your point of view is that they are looking at they're making the women central here and visible. And it doesn't stress the antagonism between the two women. So that to me is interesting. I mean, there are other problems with it, but
Right.
but that does stand out as very different than what we get when we, sort of read the story in the Torah.
Yeah, very much so. These Midrashim do place women in the center.
Yeah.
And that in itself is powerful. And the other thing that I think is so important is just these are ancient texts, right? There are holy texts, so they're supposed to speak to us today, but there also are ancient texts. And so I'm not going to expect an ancient text written in the 5th century to match my values today.
Mm-hmm.
My question is going to be, though, since it is a holy text for me, what do I do with this text, even though it doesn't necessarily match my values, right? What might I be able to draw, learn, reread, etc., because it is holy? But things from the 1950s don't always match our values. So why would we expect something from the 5th century to line up?
Well, they may do better than the 1950s, actually.
Sometimes they do. Yes, absolutely they do. But that's another story. Yes, touche. I pulled the 1950s out from.
Remember the movie Mona Lisa Smiles with Julie Roberts, if you saw it?
I have not seen that one.
I don't know. We won't get into it, but it's interesting. It's in the 1950s at Vassar Wellesley.
Okay, I'll have to watch.
Not Jewish.
That's fine. Judith.
I really find this a stunning way of putting together the Midrash and the biblical text. And I just want to, for me, the idea that that you developed for us, that we can take that and really very painful parallel between what Sarah enables in terms of the near-death experience of Yishmael, and what she does to Hagar, and actually twice it seems that she really inflicts great pain on Hagar, but this is almost fatal pain on Hagar. That the idea that parallel, in fact, could be imagined as one in which Sarah and Hagar somehow come together because Sarah rethinks what she has been responsible for, mm-hmm. through the experience of having had something similar inflicted upon her. That is that the experience of something being done to her own son, that is that near-death experience, which could easily have been a death, enables her to learn something about what she has been responsible for, and what her fellow mother, her partner in motherhood, actually had gone through what she herself had done. This is something that seems to me to be really profound and just an incredibly powerful reading for us to sort of take to heart when we read this Torah reading.
Thank you first of all, Judith. And as I'm listening to you, I'm also wondering if we might want to push off Sarah's death a little bit and say, it's not exactly up against the Akedah, right? After the story of the Akedah, we actually have this paragraph which also describes Rivka, who we know will become Yitzchak's wife. So I wonder if we might want to say, actually, it's not quite smichut parshiot. They're not quite one after the other. There's other stuff that happens. And then our midrashic task becomes to rewrite the conversations that then happened between Hagar and Sarah. So as I'm thinking to myself, if this was an extended Midrash course, that would probably be my assignment, which is go home and imagine what happened between Hagar and Sarah, and then we'd come back and we'd share those imaginations. Sherry.
It strikes me also that the stories placed in juxtaposition this way have a different moral, and it's not about any of the human protagonists, it's about God. Because in both cases, we expect, it looks like we're headed to the deaths of the boys. Ishmael will die from lack of water. And it never says the boy cried out, but it says God heard the cry of the voice. And there's a whole lot of Midrash about that. And Isaac is about to be sacrificed, but it's the voice that not of God, but the God's messenger that stops that one as well. So the narrative takes a different turn. It looks like if we have a nice classic fairy tale and the boys are going to die, but the narrative says, that's not the way it's happening. And these stories are not about you human beings. They're about God's plans in the world. And the Rivka appearing on the scene is precisely about that, because that's going to be the next generation and the line of Abraham through Isaac. And it's once again God's plans triumphing. And in a way, maybe this whole digression into the lives of the boys and the relationships of them, of Abraham with both the women and the women with, I love what you said about the women with each other. But that's not, I won't say it's not the point of the story, but it's not the only point of the story. And there is a deeper moral, which has to do with God's ways in the world. And that connects it deeply to Rosh Hashanah.
Yes, and I would also say the human part connects it deeply to Rosh Hashanah, because there are those two parts where we're interrogating our relationship with God and are interrogating our relationships with one another.
Yeah.
And so perhaps if we can hold both of those, that these stories contain God's plan for us, and also that these stories contain the tragedies, intricacies, these love affairs of humans, that perhaps they can push us to engage in both of those relationships during the Yamim Noraim and not feel like we need to choose one over the other.
Yeah.
So I'm going to say thank you so much to all of you for joining me tonight and to learning with me. It was really a pleasure to learn with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Excellent.
much.
Thank you, Jane.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful teaching. And thank you all for your comments and adding to the conversation. And Lila Tov.